When it comes to a story as detailed as Mushoku Tensei, there's bound to be a whole plethora of information that doesn't make it into the anime. Like, for this episode in particular, there was quite a bit of cut content regarding Kishirika and her 12 demon eyes. We don't get to learn about all 12 of the ones that she used to have, but we do get a rather solid description of the ones that were available to Rudeus. That plus a deeper look into how exactly Rudy's Eye of Foresight works. Of course, I am going to talk about the other scenes as well, but I think for this season of cut content, I'm only going to focus on the major stuff. That way I can also do lore videos on topics like the sword styles or labyrinths. There's a whole bunch of these other intriguing fantasy elements that the anime barely even mentions. So I really want to share those in combination with all these cut content videos. For now though, let's focus on episode 12 and the demon eyes introduced within it. But first, this video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends, the free-to-play mobile RPG that just keeps on giving. This time bringing us a whole new faction of crazy-looking dark elves for you to add to your collection. So, in addition to amazing graphics, strategic gameplay, and an immersive storyline, we now also have this new fiendish cult of dark elves. New champions like the legendary Foliar Rule, who honestly look like characters straight out of Sung Jin-woo's Army of Shadows. I mean, they are the branch of elves who succumbed to the temptation of what's pretty much this world's demon lord. What I personally like the most though are all the options Raid provides for both PvP and PvE. Like, if you want to test your team against another person, then feel free to get a little bit sweaty over in the arena. If you want to cooperate with other people, then you can easily join a clan and take on one of the massive clan bosses. There's so much to do even after completing the lengthy campaign. Plus, with a packed schedule of special events like the upcoming Halloween one, there's a whole bunch of new rewards to be gained and tournaments to play in. So, if you want to get a huge head start in Raid, then just hit the link in the description or scan my QR code and you'll instantly get the Epic Hero Konoru, 200,000 silver, 1 XP boost, 1 energy refill, and 1 ancient shard to summon a brand new champion, all of which you'll be able to find right here in your inbox. But anyway, now let's get back to the video. Episode 12, The Woman with the Demon Eyes, covering chapters 1 to 3 from volume 4 of the light novel. One of the very first things that really gets highlighted in the novels is just how far Rudeus has traveled since being teleported to the demon continent. His initial landing was pretty much on the exact opposite side of the map from where his hometown was. Then the last few episodes of part 1 were spent in this town here. Where we find Rudeus now though is all the way down here in the demon continent's sole port city of Windport, a destination that took them the greater part of a year to arrive at. It was during this lengthy journey that Rudeus and Ruijerd had taught Eris the demon god tongue as best they could. It's not like she could read or write in it yet, but she could speak it relatively fluently, which was pretty much the most important part of teaching it to her anyway. Other than that, there hadn't really been much time to teach her anything else. So not only was Eris not making any progress with her magic, but it was also likely she forgot all the chants for the spell she'd learned in the first place. When Rudeus went on to talk about Ruijerd next, we were actually given a little more detail as to what exactly the red jewel in his forehead did. Apparently it worked like some form of radar, a sixth sense that could detect the presence of every living creature within several hundred meters, kind of like a permanent UAV or Blackbird. So when Ruijerd said that there were a lot of monsters in the water, he really wasn't joking since he could sense every single one of them. Now, after their time on the beach, the first place Rudeus went was to the Adventurers Guild. He wanted to see what types of quests were available for what type of payment, mainly because he'd heard that quests in the Demon Continent paid significantly less than quests in the Millis Continent. So, since he was right at the border, he felt like it was useful to keep a reference of just how much more he'd be making. As for the difference between these two continents' forms of currency, well, the Millis Continent was obviously worth more. There were 6 types of coins, each with their own Demon Continent exchange rate, a conversion that really didn't motivate Rudeus to want to work anymore. If the Millis Continent did in fact pay more for the same type of work, then there really wasn't any point for them to do quests anymore. Unless they had absolutely nothing else to do, quests were definitely no longer the most beneficial use of their time. For the ones that they did do before though, most were the short and simple B-ranked missions. Not because they weren't qualified for the A or S rank ones, but mainly because those were often highly dangerous and very lengthy. It wasn't uncommon for an A or S rank party to spend more than a week doing these very dangerous expeditions. So, to a logical thinker like Rudeus, there were simply too many negatives to even consider them. Yes, there were special benefits for being at the S rank, but he personally didn't believe that it was worth the trouble. especially since the only thing they were interested in was money to cross the border. Now, after Rudeus had gathered all the information he needed, he wasn't surprised to turn around and see that Eris had gotten into another fight. It seemed the more proficient she'd become with the demon god tongue, the more likely it was for her to lash out and fight someone. They were encounters that typically ended with the other person getting their face stomped in. Moving on to when they had gotten to the checkpoint, we actually find out that the reason a spurd costs so much to travel is mainly due to the high level of danger that comes with carrying them. If a spurd was to make its way to another continent, then there was no telling what type of damage it'd be able to do once it got there. So the high price was more like a precaution to deter against terrorism. Given that this was their current predicament, Rudeus had actually gone and come up with 3 viable solutions. The first was to earn money through adventuring, but saving such a vast amount would likely take over a year. The second was to raid a labyrinth and retrieve a magic crystal, but even with Ruijerd's overpowered sixth sense, the dangers that lay within were still far too many. Yes, they could likely make all the money in a single go, but the number of traps in a labyrinth were something he didn't want to mess with, especially since Ruijerd himself seemed rather hesitant. The third and final option then was to simply find and hire a smuggler, an unlawful approach that Rudeus felt he should avoid if possible. So realistically, none of these options were quite the ideal. The next point in the story brings us to Rudy's encounter with the Empress of the Demon World. As he was wandering down the back alleys of the port, Rudy had overheard a strange man offering a little girl food in exchange for following him. The instant Rudy realized that this was what the man god was leading him to, he instantly fired off a couple stone cannons to knock out the man confronting her. It was then that he saw the horns protruding from the head of the girl he just saved. As soon as 2 and 2 came together, Rudeus immediately began to assume that this was a succubus. He thought that perhaps the man god was finally rewarding him for all his hard work. But after giving it a bit more thought, Rudeus quickly remembered that succubi weren't even part of the demon race. You see, because they were widely considered to be the natural enemy of the Grey Rat family, Paul had made sure to teach him that they were only found in the Begarit continent. So there was no way that this girl could actually be one. No, she was just some demon kid in extremely skimpy clothing. After that distinction was made, that's when their conversation began to get a little bit interesting. Not only was there a few cut lines highlighting her relationship with the demon god Laplace, but there was also a bit more context given as to why she found Rudeus disgusting. When she was finally able to get a good look at him, her blue eye of magical power had allowed her to see that his mana pool was actually larger than Laplace's. So, given that this was such a shocking development, Kishirika went on to ask a rather unusual question. She asked if he happened to have a twin that died in the womb with him. I'm not entirely sure what the implication of this question is, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't just asked for any random reason. If I had to guess, there's probably something regarding a human's birth that helps to determine their level of mana. It's the only logical conclusion given the context of the question. In any case, there was actually quite a bit of validity behind Rudeus's assumption that this supposed demon empress was just a role-playing child. I mean, this was after all the demon continent. So it did make sense then that someone like the demon god Laplace would be seen as one of their heroes. Of course, Rudeus knew the disgusting truth about what this demon god really did, but there was no denying the fact that he had successfully brought peace to all the tribes of this continent. Without his intervention, there wouldn't be any fixed places like Windport for these demons to call their home. So it wasn't surprising that Laplace was this great figure that children would want to roleplay as. In fact, it was actually a fairly common sight to see throughout his travels. On the other hand, despite Kishirika being a historic figure almost as prominent as Laplace, Rudeus couldn't say he'd ever seen any kids trying to be her before, leading him to the conclusion that we saw in the anime. When Kishirika went on to offer him his reward next, she made sure to clarify what each of the eyes did before having him choose the one that he wanted. You see, Rudeus only knew of the eyes that turned people to stone, but because Kishirika was such a young reincarnation of her former self, she didn't yet possess any of the extremely powerful ones that she used to have. Of the ones that she did have though, first were the most common eyes of magical power, a type of eye that allowed its user to see mana directly, and it was this type that was possessed by approximately 1 in 10,000 people. Next were the eyes of identification, which pretty much worked like an encyclopedia. Not only would they identify the object that the user was looking at, but it would also provide extensive details regarding what it was. The only downside though was that those details had to come from the user's already existing knowledge. After this was a pair of eyes that Kishirika knew was practically perfect for Rudy. You see, these were the eyes of X-ray vision, and while they did indeed allow its user to see through inanimate objects, they also didn't let them see through anything that was living or surrounded by high concentrations of mana. So I'm sure you don't need me to tell you what exactly Rudy would be using these eyes for. Kishirika then went on to the far-seeing eyes of Distant Sight, a pair that allowed its user to see things from very far away, but at the same time made it very hard to focus. They really weren't that useful for anything other than extremely long-range recon. Next were the future-seeing eyes of Foresight, then the last were the mana-consuming eyes of Absorption, both of which had their own ups and downs, but the fact that the Absorption ones consumed the user's own mana did make it objectively worse than the Foresight one. So, with that being all the options, Rudeus found he couldn't quite decide on only a single one. It was a tough decision that led him to ask if Kishirika could give him two. This wasn't a request that she really minded accepting, but it also wasn't one that she recommended. Reason being that having two demon eyes made it incredibly hard to focus, much to the point that he probably wouldn't even be able to see out of them. If he spent the next 100 years training, then it definitely was possible that he'd be able to control them. But for a child like him who was only just getting into his teens, having two would most definitely make him lose his mind. That's why people like Ghislaine who only have one are often seen covering their demon eye with an eye patch. So, as Rudeus continued to ponder which one would be the most effective, there was only one that gave a very clear advantage. Distant Sight wasn't something he really needed, and Absorption was too much of a detriment than it was an asset. Identification wasn't all that useful given Rudeus's current knowledge, and magical power was far too common for him to choose over all the others. Then X-ray vision simply meant he would constantly have to see Rudeus naked. So that left only the Eye of Foresight, a power Rudeus obtained after entertaining what he thought was just the playful mind of a little girl. How he saw her now, though, was more like this magical girl who was being led on by the law of cycles. Now, as for how this demon eye worked, well, the basic premise was that there were two types of focus, both of which were controlled via the way that mana was being channeled into it. The first was a type of focus that controlled opacity. When this was at its max, everything he saw appeared completely doubled, giving him a highly distorted vision of reality that was way too hard to distinguish. If he was to shift that mana more towards the inner part of his eye though, that's when that opacity would be down to its lowest, effectively minimizing the visibility of the future doubles that he would normally see. Because seeing into the future was so beneficial though, Rudeus decided to keep the mana channeled in a spot slightly above the minimum. That way he could still see glimpses into the future, all while not being entirely distracted by how it distorted his vision. It was a level of mastery that only took 3 days of training to keep consistent. With that being the first type of focus, it would then make sense that the second was a type of focus that controlled latency, the aspect of his eye that determined how far or how little into the future that he could see. With 0 mana being channeled to the forefront of his eye, the most Rudeus could see forward was only a second. But by focusing more and more mana into that specific area, he was able to start seeing upwards of 3 to 5 seconds. The longer he tried to look into the future though, the more branches of reality he would see and the more blurry the image would become, essentially turning his vision into a completely incomprehensible mess of potential futures. It also taxed the brain to the point that it would give him a headache. So, after another 3 days of training, Rudeus had finally learned how to consistently and safely see 1 second into the future. He now possessed proficient mastery over both the type of focuses his new demon eye provided for him. Now, while we did get to see how useful this eye was against Eris, we unfortunately didn't get to see how someone like Rudeus could beat it. You see, just because Rudeus could see 1 second into the future, didn't mean that it was a future he could always react to. Plus, depending on what or who he was looking at, there was always the chance that they themselves would be fast enough to blur his vision with different potential possibilities of the future, which is exactly what happened during his fight with Rudeus. When Rudeus had gone in for his initial attack, Rudeus was able to dodge it much like how he did to Eris. But it was after that initial movement was made that Rudeus began to initiate his own counter, a rapid motion that blurred Rudy's vision with 2 completely different futures. In one there was a Rudeus who grabbed his arm, and the other was a Rudeus who caught his face with a punch, neither of which Rudy could avoid since he was already caught in the motion of dodging. So even though Rudeus could see exactly what Rudeus was going to do, there wasn't anything that he could do to stop it, resulting in Rudy's face being treated like a volleyball. If you're wondering what exactly had happened, well, Rudeus' skill had allowed him to come up with multiple options during the fight. If Rudeus was to defend with his hand, then Ruijerd was ready to grab his arm. If he didn't do anything though, then Ruijerd would simply finish the fight with a punch. Those were the two outcomes in which Rudy envisioned because they were the two actions Ruijerd had committed himself to making. It was a gap in experience that no level of foresight could help prepare him against, making it very clear that the eye did in fact have its weaknesses. Moving on to the scene with Eris and Rudy. Aside from Eris leaning up on him like how we see in the novel, there was a lot more self-reflection going on during his conversation with her. While normally this type of situation would get his heart racing a mile a minute, Rudeus could only feel ashamed for having been dishonest. He completely agreed that this new power of his wasn't fair to Eris. So, despite it being something he initially felt that he could rely on, Rudeus decided right here that he wouldn't. He decided it was best to only use it as his trump card. To do anything else with it would most likely end up turning it into a crutch, an undesirable outcome that he almost failed to even consider. Now, if you're confused as to what exactly was going on during the events of episode 2, well, a lot of the context for the whole prison break was skipped when they decided to not show Gallus' offer. You see, Gallus was a member of a smuggling organization that he was trying to look out for. But despite his best advice, the higher-ups still went and decided to smuggle some goods that he knew would get them into trouble. Yes, it would sell for an exorbitant price, but there was no doubt the trade would come back and haunt them. So, in an attempt to save his friends, Gallus decided to make a deal with Rudy. In exchange for the safe release of those goods, Ruijerd could tag along on the next ship over to the Millis continent, a deal that resulted in the events we saw from episode 2. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this episode of Cut Content. It's not exactly everything we missed from the episode, but it does cover a majority of what I think was important. Now, as I said before, rather than do a Cut Content episode every week, I'm actually planning to do one every other week. That way, in between the weeks that I don't do one, I can instead focus on those lore topics that I mentioned in the beginning. So, if you want to see more videos like that, then be sure to subscribe with notifications turned on. And if you did happen to enjoy today's video, then don't forget to leave a like and comment. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!